Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another afternoon tea with me, Gareth. I'm glad you could join me this afternoon. We're finishing up John chapter 16. So let's grab our Bibles and let's get stuck right in. Now, confusion reigns among the disciples. You'll notice in the first bit of this passage that they're getting caught up with a particular term, a little while. Now, time has been an important component in much of this conversation between Jesus and his disciples. And here they want to know what he means by, in a little while, you'll see me no more. The key to the answer, I think, is in verse 20. Jesus says in 16 verse 20, "Very truly I tell you, you'll weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You'll grieve, but your grief will turn to joy." And Jesus doesn't want his disciples to get caught up in this time language, so he tells them that the time is coming when they're going to mourn and the world's going to rejoice. That, of course, happens when Jesus dies. And so that's when a little while really refers to. It's the death and time of Jesus' resurrection when he appears to his disciples again. That's when the world will rejoice. The world's going to rejoice because it thinks that it has overcome Jesus. It's conquered Christ. And the disciples are weeping and mourning and grieving, terms associated with death. But we see that a great reversal is going to happen. Their mourning is going to be turned into joy. Of course, a term that is associated with life. Jesus very helpfully uses a little illustration of a woman who gives birth to a child. She's in pain during the labor process because the child is coming. But as soon as the baby is born, that pain is long gone. In a heartbeat, in the blink of an eye, the pain is gone because there is new life in her hands, and that brings her great joy. And Jesus might possibly be referring to an Old Testament term. In the Old Testament, childbirth was an illustration that was used to describe the suffering that God's people might go through before the coming salvation of the Messiah. Isaiah 26 is an example where you can read up on this. And so perhaps Jesus has that in mind. He, of course, is the Messiah. And so the people of God are going to go through a period of suffering now, but there is great joy that's coming when the Messiah returns for them. Jesus again says in verse 22, "So now with you, your time of grief is here, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." You're going to see Jesus again. This is not talking about the second coming, but this is talking about his post-resurrection appearance to his disciples. That's when they are going to understand who Jesus is, and that's when they are going to have joy. Joy here is more than just happiness. It's a new state of being. It's a new condition. Joy is objective, and that joy is grounded in Jesus Christ. A Christian joy is bound up with Christ. And so that's what's going to be happening for the disciples when they see Jesus again. Jesus says that there are going to be a whole bunch of changes in that day. From verse 23 onwards, Jesus starts to use this term. In that day, things are going to change for the disciples, particularly with relation to the Father. There's going to be a change with regards to access to the Father, but there's also going to be a change with regards to affection for the Father. Jesus says in that day you will be able to pray to the Father directly, and you can ask for anything in my name. There will be this access that the disciples previously didn't have to God the Father, but now they will have it. Jesus also says, I will no longer speak metaphorically or figuratively to you. I'm going to be speaking plainly, simply, because the disciples will then have had the full revelation. They will know everything that they need to know. They'll have full understanding of who Jesus is. And so Jesus will be able to speak plainly to them. Perhaps the greatest reversal that's going to be happening, or the greatest perk or blessing or benefit for the disciples, is in verse 27. The Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. The Father himself is going to love the disciples. Why? Because the disciples loved Jesus and they believed in Jesus. If you love Jesus and you believe in Jesus, well, God the Father himself loves you. And what a great blessing that is. The disciples, of course, want that blessing now. They say, "Oh Lord, we understand," in verse 29 onwards. "Now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech." Of course, they're trying to usher the time in a bit sooner, but that's not how it works. God's plan must work according to his timing. And so Jesus nips it in the bud. He tells it to them straight and says, "Look, unfortunately, do you believe now? Well, guess what? You're all going to scatter. You're going to abandon me, and it's just going to be me and the Father. I'm going to be alone because now is my time. Now, your time will come, but you need to wait a little while." John 16:33 concludes the formal teaching of the upper room discourse. Chapter 17 is a prayer, not that a prayer can't be teaching, but here in particular he draws it to a close. It bookends beautifully with John 14 verse 1. In John 14 verse 1, Jesus said, "Don't let your hearts be troubled." Now, of course, he uses that famous phrase, "Take heart." Jesus says, "I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace." Earlier again in John 14, Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you." And so Jesus affirms that message here. In me, you will have peace. At the same time, in this world, you're going to have trouble. And the trouble he's spoken about at length, I guess, in chapter 15 and the first part of chapter 16. In this world, you're going to have trouble. But don't grieve, don't mourn, don't weep, don't despair. Take heart. Stand firm, my disciples. Why? Well, because I've overcome the world. Jesus is victorious. He's already victorious. He has overcome the world. But he's going to walk that road to the cross, die that death that he alone can die, and be raised to life, so that he can show us all that he was who he said he was, and so that he can overcome the world. The world thought that it had overcome Jesus, but in fact, Jesus has overcome the world. He did it back then. It's been part of God's plan from time past. It's true even to this day. Jesus has overcome the world. And so the message of the upper room is for us to take heart, for us to be comforted, for us to be assured, for us to have peace of mind, really, that Jesus is victorious and that everything works in accordance with God's purposes, God's plans, and God's timing. So I think that you can turn John 16:33 into your prayer for this afternoon or this evening. Thank God that he sent his Son, and that even though we have trouble in this world, we have uncertainties, we have anxieties, we have real difficulties, we can take heart because Jesus has overcome the world. And so we can have joy now already. We might not always have feelings of happiness, but we can certainly always have joy. And so I hope that that's been a real encouragement to you. Tomorrow we begin to look at the prayer of Jesus as we wrap up this afternoon tea series, and I look forward to seeing you then. Cheers.